But today I'm going to talk a little bit about a slightly newer focus that we've been having on the whole move of patient care into the home and the increasing number of patients and lay people that are being increasingly required to use medical technology, and to talk a little bit about some of that work. So I'm just going to give a bit of an introduction into what user research is and why that's important for medical device development. A couple of case study examples, and then just a few recommendations about, I guess, lessons that I've learned certainly, and the manufacturers that I've been working with have learned also about how to do this work in a practical way and sort of to do it in the right way and ensure that the results can be implemented into the development. And then also a few pitfalls as well, which I've fallen into and have seen other people fall into as well. I did this slide for another talk that I was doing a couple of months ago, and it was actually talking to some of the other people that we work with on Match, and that whole idea is actually what do we mean by user research and what's user needs and what's collecting user requirements. And we just came up with this sort of working definition, I guess, which is the whole idea of talking to, observing, but also just generally learning about the people who will affect the use of a device in the real world in order to understand who they are, what they need, what they want, might be different things, where they do it, what they do and how they do it, what are they able to do, also what are they willing to do, what do they want to do, and how and why all of these things vary and how they'll affect how a device is used in the real world. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, why you study user requirements. This is an important thing to do in any product development. It gives us valuable information about market research, hopefully reduce time to market and get a better product to market quicker, hopefully increase market acceptance and reduce the need to do expensive modifications. But there's a number of aspects why in healthcare this is even more important, and fundamental, one of those being improved safety, and there's an increased regulatory requirement to do this sort of work before you can even place a device on the market. And I sit on the AMI Human Factors Engineering Committee, who we're responsible for writing HE 75, and we'll be revising 62366 in the next couple of years and advising the FDA on the requirements for this, and working with the FDA on that, producing some of their draft guidance, which is out at the moment, has been really interesting for me, and seeing some of the submissions that come from manufacturers and where manufacturers are frustrated with the guidance that's out there at the moment, and struggling to demonstrate all the work that they've done, and sometimes not realising how much work they have done, and only submitting information on final usability tests rather than the earlier research which the FDA wants to see. Also, we've done on Match a lot of work with small medical device companies, and it's increasingly a requirement for them to get development grants to say that you're going to be doing user involvement, user requirements, all those sorts of things which I'm never quite sure what people mean when they say them. But ultimately, it's all about better devices, improved outcomes, of course it is. On Match, I think we've taken quite a broad look at what we mean by user requirements, and taking it to mean more than just clinical effectiveness and safety. I think for me they're the basics, but in order to develop a device that is going to be truly successful commercially and in terms of patient outcomes, you need to do more than just clinical effectiveness and safety, but those are difficult enough, and my experience at the MPSA certainly shown me that. So, it's not just about the device as well, it's about the packaging of the device. So, packaging of the device has got to be strong enough to ensure that it's going to survive the wear and tear of the logistics in order to get to the operating theatre or wherever. Yet, it's also still got to be easy enough to get into quickly, so that the operating theatre assistant hasn't got to resort to a scalpel or a pair of scissors to stab into something quickly because the surgeon's shouting for it and risks nicking it, and might not realise that it's not working as it should be. In the same way, infusion pumps need to work effectively and safely, but they should also support the overworked, the stress, the high cognitive load on nurses and other people working in this incredibly complex and highly stressful environment, to ensure that they know that they've programmed the infusion device quickly. If they make a mistake, they can recover from it really quickly, reduce frustrations, reduce errors, improve safety. But it's not just healthcare workers, increasingly, it's different environments and it's different users, and all these sorts of things have to be considered in the development process. And increasingly, devices are going into the home, and people use things very differently in the home. They have very different requirements, they have very different types of skills, capabilities, and especially with the home, people, they're not going to be on their A game, they're going to be unwell, they might be suffering from the effects of aging, and they want things to be easy, they want things to make sense to them, and they want things, classic thing is, as soon as well, this is the case in healthcare environments too, but instruction manual will be lost with, within a couple of hours of it going in, and so instructions have to be available on the devices. And also, devices have to go out into different environments, and different operational constraints are going to affect what safety and what effectiveness is going to be in those sorts of environments. So I guess what sums up the sort of work that we've been doing on Match in all of our case studies is looking at what we call use issues. So when things go wrong or when things aren't happening as well as they possibly should, what are the consequences of that? And I guess my view of sort of looking at that is that we only really get to hear about the things when they go very badly wrong. So we hear about when people die, when people get severe harms, and some information about near misses. But that's really just sort of the tip of the iceberg. And I think that's, when these things do go very badly wrong, they're not difficult to find because they're all over the press. And when I was at the MPSA, a big part of my role was analysing these incidents and looking at the role of devices in particular in how these events happened. Devices that worked perfectly effectively and perfectly as the manufacturer intended, but because of how they were used in real life, they resulted in deaths. And some of these very high profile ones, which you might be aware of. That alarm fatigue, that's a big issue with clinical devices, that whole idea of increasing the cognitive stress and the contributing to the very noisy clinical environment, so that when the one critical alarm goes off, it just gets lost in the noise. This incident was one that really piqued my interest in the whole idea of home healthcare. When I was working at the MPSA, every week we would review all the ways that people have been killed and severely harmed in the healthcare sector, which was absolutely fascinating and terrifying both at the same time. And I was just struck by how little information we got from incidents that happened in the home, and it was very much when just things went very badly wrong. And this was something that happened at least a few times a month, where we would get reports of severe burns for people smoking while using home oxygen therapy. Why is this happening? Are they just simply ignoring the warnings or being desperate, to have a cigarette, which is probably the reason why they're on oxygen therapy in the first place? And that was the sort of first reaction of, how could people be so stupid? And were they just ignoring the warnings? But actually, as in with all human factors, the reality is a bit more complicated than that. And you think about, were they unaware of the risks? Some people don't know that oxygen is a flammable gas. That picture there in the bottom right is probably the ideal about how those devices are introduced to patients. But in reality, we know, we're in the process of doing a study on this at Nottingham at the moment, the whole idea about how these devices are introduced into people's homes. In reality, there someone's got a lot of time to explain the risks to people, to say, it's very important that you do this, and it's very important that you don't smoke. Manufacturers put no smoking warnings all over these devices, but actually, when you look at how they're introduced, people are overloaded. The people doing it, they haven't got time to go through all the warnings. They put the canisters directly, normally behind somebody's chair, and those people then don't see them from a day-to-day basis. The warnings aren't reinforced. Often they're not the person replacing them, so they might not see them for long periods of time. Also, when they were introduced, they might have been introduced to the risks. Information overload to a patient who is ill, perhaps elderly. Getting all of this complex equipment being loaded into their information, is not surprising that these sort of things can slip by the wayside. So, warning signs hidden from the user. So, I guess, yeah, when I just started thinking, what are all the other issues going on that we don't know about and we never get to hear about? All this is, it's difficult enough when equipment goes off into the clinical environment, but when it goes off into the home, how much do we know about the other use issues where people just aren't getting the most benefit from a device? So incorrect use, infrequent use, just people giving up. We know that these are big issues with home medical devices. What about even overuse? The worried well, people becoming over-reliant on the information provided these. So just going to give you a very brief run through from a couple of case studies that we did within Match, looking at some of these issues and the reasons behind them. So we've been doing quite a long project on the whole idea of EpiPens for anaphylaxis, mostly in relation to food allergies. And there's a big issue with this. Research has shown that people just don't carry their devices when they're needed. The use issue, EpiPens not being carried. When you look at that from a sort of manufacturer's point of view and the focus for manufacturers, manufacturers want to ensure that if you've got your device when you need it and you use it, it's effective and that it doesn't cause unnecessary harm. So, it's got to be strong enough to get through your clothes, and you've got to be able to correctly dispense the medication into your leg. And these devices work very well at that. They're nice and strong, they're nice and robust, and although there are small number of needle stick injuries, they're generally pretty good. But we know that lots of people don't carry them with them, and then it doesn't matter how effective it is if it's sat at home. So we wanted to look at what some of these reasons were, and we were predominantly interested in device issues. But as we found, it was a lot more complicated than that. So there's some factors that influence both. Manufacturers want the device to be strong enough, to be robust, to be strong enough so that it will go through the skin and through clothing. But that makes it large, it makes it cumbersome, it makes it heavy, and people don't want to, either they haven't got the right bag or the right trousers to put it in their pocket, or they don't want to be taking it out and about. So there's that sort of balancing act of those issues. But what was most interesting, I think, from our perspective, was the range of other factors that affected why people didn't use them. I think risk perception was the main thing. People were saying that when they were first prescribed it, they were told that it was very important that they had it. They used to carry it all the time. And then in reality, actually, it didn't appear that it wasn't that important to have it. They'd never, they started not taking it out, nothing ever happened, or they had it with them, they never had to use it. And so, adherence kind of drops off a little bit. So there's that idea of awareness of risks. They also reported that they'd had very little training, so they'd never actually used it in anger. So they were saying, actually, I'm not quite sure when I do need to use it, is it a case of, if my lips are just starting to tingle a little bit, or does my tongue have to be swelling up and virtually filling my mouth? And what are the issues if I use it and I didn't really need it? There's that sort of danger of using it when not required. Training was a big issue. Also, I think you can't underestimate the social effects and stigma and things like this for people with long-term conditions who have to carry a device which identifies them as such. Teenagers especially were quite worried about this. They were worried about having, sometimes they wanted to go out and just not be that person who had that condition and had to take it. They were concerned about if they went to places where they had to be security checks, that people might find it and think it was a weapon. They were also worried that people might use it on them if they were mugged and attacked. Also, another idea with another issue with things like prescriptions was the whole idea of expiry dates. The expiry dates on these devices, sometimes they were getting from the chemist and they had about 2 or 3 weeks left on them. Sometimes they might use them never, or maybe once or twice a year. So they were carrying out-of-date devices which they reported they didn't know whether or not they worked or not anyway. So actually, it wasn't a whole lot about the device, which was the reason why people didn't carry it. We did a big project up in Nottingham. One of my PhD students was looking at the whole idea of physiotherapy for cystic fibrosis. This was an incredibly interesting study, especially because these physiotherapy for teenagers, it was focusing on teenagers, this study, has been, it's one of the most important reasons why people with cystic fibrosis are living into adulthood and a relatively long life. And it's perceived as such by the teenagers themselves. They know that doing regular physiotherapy is incredibly important, but they still don't do it as much as they should. Adolescents are generally bad compliers with medication and with treatment for long-term conditions. It's a hard time of life when they're transitioning from parents doing everything for them to doing it themselves. But it's really important in setting good behaviours for long-term care of a long-term condition, and they're also rather ignored. So this was really interesting study. The company had done a lot of work on trying to design specifically for paediatrics, and they had a device which people are supposed to use about 3 times a day for about 20 minutes each time. And they turned it into what looked like a dolphin, and it was really cool. And small children loved it, but teenagers, were saying, it doesn't suit my needs. It's completely babyish. So there was that sort of aesthetic thing, which we kind of assumed would be important to adolescents. But what was really interesting was that they had so much more interesting feedback to give. The predominant one of them was saying, I don't know when I'm doing it right. I know I have to maintain the right posture. I know I have to get the right vibrations in my lungs, but I don't know if I'm doing it correctly. Every time I go to the clinic, I get told off about my posture, about standing up straight, getting the right angle, but I just don't know. And I think that's so important with these sorts of devices for when patients are, in a sense, continually deteriorating. They're not going to get an improvement in this sort of COPD, cystic fibrosis. You're just stalling the onset of symptoms. And so if you're not getting that feedback from your body to say you're getting better, your symptoms are getting better, if it's just a case of your symptoms are getting worse but more slowly, the device has to step in and do that role of feedback of saying it is worth continuing, you are getting the benefits from that. And I think that's a really interesting issue to deal with when you're dealing with adherence. Blood glucose testing. We did a project for the NHS. They wanted us to look at the effect of device features on adherence for patients with type 2 diabetes, so they were very much focused on the device. Inevitably, we found out that it wasn't too much to do with the device, really. Glucose testing, it's a simple task. I think there's that perception within healthcare, and particularly maybe within the people prescribing this now, it is so common to them that maybe they don't understand what a challenge it is for some patients. We find out that if you do a task analysis, it's actually a very complicated task, and all of these are perhaps a barrier to regular testing. But one of the big issues with lack of compliance was what the healthcare professionals say is that patients don't do what we tell them to do. We tell them to take a nice test once a day for reassurance. Actually, patients want more than that. They want, and this is a constant theme through all of the long-term condition work that we've done with devices, is that patients want to understand. They want control. It's very much about allowing them that self-efficacy of self-management of living with a long-term condition, and they want more than just a reassurance check that they're not about to keel over in the next half an hour. And what that was leading to was poor communication and even deception between them and their healthcare professionals. So my view is that giving people technology is all about improving communication between patients and healthcare professionals, sharing information, sharing feedback, getting advice, but this was having a complete opposite effect because people were lying about what they were doing. In reality, they were testing 3 or 4 times a day, but they were telling their nurses that they were only testing once a day because they were frightened that if the nurses found out, they'd stop prescribing them the strips when they were dependent on the strips to do their regular testing. And they could see this happening in the future, so some of them were hoarding test strips so that they could continue. Training was very variable. People were just being literally given a sealed box, and so they were accessing the internet, they were accessing forums, experimenting themselves. Also, there were a lot of device-related issues. Innovation always seemed smaller devices possible. Again, patients were then keeping things from their healthcare providers. They'd been given an older lady that we met. She'd been given a very small device, which some of the younger people we included really enjoyed, really liked. That was great for them. You could attach it to their computer, it worked really well. She was lying, not for, I think she felt guilty because she was expected, I think she felt like she should be grateful for getting this new device, but it was too small, she couldn't read it, she couldn't use the buttons. She was using a device that was more than 10 years old, but she hadn't told a clinician. Was that working properly? Who knows? So it's that whole idea of shared goals. I'll skip through that because I haven't got time. So yeah, just a sort of summary of issues, I guess, findings from all our kind of work on this area. Obviously, patients have got to be able to use the device. Of course they have. But they've also got to be willing to use the device and to be able to get something out of it themselves. You've got to look at patients' needs and how they monitor. For example, that lady with diabetes, her eyesight deteriorated, her dexterity on her fingers had deteriorated, and that's why she couldn't use the new device, one of the reasons. Patients have to want to use the device. What's in it for them? It's got to be more about than just transferring a clinical task to the patient in order to save money and keep people out of hospital. Otherwise, people just won't do it, even when they know it's really important. Acceptance of a device is acceptance that you've got a condition that might ultimately going to kill you, and that is going to affect how people view these devices. Shared goals, this idea of concordance, shared decision making, people are much more likely to use devices if that's the case, and improve communication between patients and healthcare professionals. That's very much taking from medication research that has shown benefits in that. And feedback, and is the device, can that replace the feedback from patient symptoms that what they're doing is worthwhile? And I'll just leave those up there maybe, just to, that's some of the pitfalls that people have got into, focusing down too quickly in development and then realising later on that you've missed something really important. I've done that, I know. Not appreciating the importance of user information. It's not just about aesthetics and making something look nice. Assuming that people are able to tell you what they need and what they want, over relying on just talking to people. You've got to observe, you've got to understand the environment, you've got to understand what people's latent needs are, rather than just focusing on a task and getting somebody to perform a task. I would say the most important thing is all about challenging your assumptions. I'm involved with lots of projects that I know it could be something really good, and it sometimes can blind you to when people are saying, that's not what we want something different. It's very, that's the whole point, I think, of doing user research, is to challenge your assumptions all the way through. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much. Okay, any questions on user needs there? There's one here at the front.
I'll bring the mic over. Hello. There's a trend at the moment, certainly that we're seeing, where people are endeavouring to connect home test devices to smartphones and tablets and things like that.
Yeah.
How do you see this affecting the way that you might do your human factors work in getting a device approved, and what pitfalls do you think?
Yeah, that is something I'm involved with a project at the moment, actually, which is attempting to do that very thing for sickle cell disease. Well, I think the fundamental question is, if you attach something to an app or a mobile phone, does it become a medical device in itself? That's, I think, from what I know, the FDA are taking a slightly harder line on that than Europe at the moment. But it seems to me that the cut-off point becomes when, if the app is doing any kind of, applying any kind of algorithm or anything like that to interpret the information and then present it back to the user in a way that then they might act on it differently than if they just had the information from the app as opposed to the device. I think it makes it, I think it's all about risk, and I think it introduces a lot of different risks, which is the idea of, I think I talk to a lot of people with long-term conditions, and they all think that technology, they want to share information, and vice versa, so do clinicians. But I think there's that idea, the biggest risk, I think, is that if people think that they are being monitored and something happens, then they're not. It's that idea of information being sent down a black hole, and you assume somebody is there at the other end monitoring it, and for whatever reason, they're not. And I think that's the biggest risk. I mean, so usability testing, it's going to make it more complicated, because you've got to design for all environments and all kinds of people. But I think it's those sort of attaching, that sort of the system together. I think that's where the biggest risk is, personally. But I think the potential is huge, but the risks are big too. That's my view.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yes, one at the back.
I'll just shout at one. Do you think there's a different interpretation of AG75 and 62366 in the
Can you just repeat the question quickly?
Oh, okay. Different interpretation of 8075 and 6336 in Europe compared to the US, as in how people in Europe are looking at both of them, or
It's really on the requirements because there are guidelines, but
Yeah.
it's in our experience, the FDA wants a different number of participants and
Yeah.
classifies user groups, distinct user groups in a different way. It seems to be more lenient within the EU.
Yeah, no, I think that is the case. That I agree. I think the FDA are much more stringent, and I think they realise that perhaps they haven't done that in the most helpful way, and I think that's why they're trying to introduce a bit more guidance. The whole sample size thing is something that we're working on in Match, because I think that some of the advice that they give seems quite arbitrary to me. They sort of pick numbers out of thin air, but I think the plan is to that I think in about 3 or 4 years' time there will just be a new 6366, which will be in 2 parts. So the first part will be 6366 at the moment. So they're just the you will do this, just the statements, and there'll be a second part which will be a rejigging of 8075 and this is how you should do it. And then I think it will be more streamlined. That's my view about where it's going in the future. But yeah, I think the FDA is more stringent, and or I don't know if it's a perception of of how they are actually, because when you see successful submissions, I don't know if they're, if you approach it in the right way, I don't think it's too difficult. I don't think it's unreasonable. I think they've struggled with their guidance.
Okay, thanks very much indeed.